Hello and welcome back to the Bird's Eye View podcast. We are here on the eve of Toronto Blue Jays pitchers and catchers reporting to spring training. I'm your host, Zach Worden, joined as always by Jori Negin-Shecter. And Jori, I wish that we could be sitting here with pitchers and catchers set to report with a little bit better news, a little bit more of some positive vibes entering. But of course, as things happen in the offseason and leading into spring, we got a dump of injury news tonight that will certainly affect the Blue Jays in 2026 and beyond, and will certainly play a major role in how things are going to shake out to begin this year. But before we get into that, how are you doing and how are you feeling about baseball? I won't say officially being back tomorrow, but almost being there.
You know what? It's on the horizon, and we're getting back to our roots with a little bit of bird's eye view after dark, and in line with those themes of, you know, late night kind of somber in your feels. The Blue Jays certainly not giving us much to cheer about at this very moment in terms of the news dump from today. This is pretty substantial. Obviously, we've been teasing it here for a sec, but Anthony Santander, 5 to 6 months. Bowden Francis, done for the year. Shane Bieber not going to be ready for opening day. Three cogs of varying importance, but certainly two important cogs. Not going to be ready to go throughout spring, delayed starts, and delayed starts in the case of Santander, which we'll discuss those ramifications, but not the kind of night you're hoping for or evening you're hoping for as spring training gets set to get rolling.
Let's start with the Santander one. I think it's the most noteworthy point that comes out of this. We already knew that Shane Bieber was dealing with some arm stuff, so we can kind of get into that after. Bowden Francis obviously sucks for him, but at the same time, it's a guy who maybe wasn't quite penciled into the Blue Jays plans for 2026 at this point. So Santander, yeah, he's going to undergo labrum surgery tomorrow, and it's a real tough way for him to start
Bounce
this
back
bounce
campaign.
back season, to start year two of this contract that he missed. He only played 54 games last year, and obviously you were kind of dreaming on him being a productive hitter in the middle of the Blue Jays lineup with a clean bill of health, and now he's gone for 5 to 6 months, and the Blue Jays top four now has lost both Bo Bichette and Anthony Santander from what was a really good offense a year ago. But I when you think of, obviously Santander wasn't there for much of that, so how much impact does it have? I think that you were certainly hoping that his bounce back would probably counteract any drop off from any of the other guys that really excelled last year.
Well, there's a bow-shaped hole in the lineup. That's what the sense was coming in. But now it's even more than that, right? You're looking at two guys that, you know, to start last year, we'll say you penciled in for probably a combined 50 homers, probably a combined 150 RBI. I mean, you want to get into some stuff like WRC plus, you figured both would be well above average guys. One guy heads to New York, and the other guy heads to Dunedin for an extended period while he tries to recover. No, this is no two ways about it. Catastrophic, maybe the strong word, but certainly the tier just below that. All of a sudden, a guy like Kazuma Okamoto is going to have to come over and transition in ways no one could have, hoped for. Addison Barger is going to have to be that much better. George Springer is going to have to be 37 years old and putting together another career season or something of the like. Listen, the pitching will be a lot better than it was last year. I think that much is certain, although obviously the Shane Bieber situation throws a wrench into that, to say the least. But it creates this sense of uncertainty so early in the campaign that it hasn't even technically started. You've got to find ways to find production out of your bats, and then in addition to that, All this talk about what is the plan with Jose Barrios. Well, turns out he's just gonna be in the rotation.
Funny how that works out, right? You sit there and there's been, so much consternation about what Barrios's role will be, and I think you kind of sit there and you're like, oh, these things generally have a way of figuring themselves out, and well, look at that, it figured itself out. So, um, it's interesting. I mean, when you think of the Blue Jays lineup here in 2026 without Anthony Santander, and I think that it's probably going to look pretty similar to the way that we saw it the last time that we saw the Blue Jays on the field, right? In Game 7 of the World Series, I think you look at their lineup in that game, and it was Springer, Lucas, Vlad, Bo, Barger, Kirk, Varsho, Ernie, and Jimenez. Like that's probably 8 of the 9 guys, and then you toss Kazuma Okamoto in there that are going to be in their opening day lineup, depending on who they face, and maybe it's Davis Schneider instead of Nathan Lucas, but certainly it's going to look like the Blue Jays that we saw towards the end of the postseason last year after Santander went down with the back injury, which of course isn't even the shoulder injury that he's having surgery for now, and the shoulder injury that kept him out for the regular season. So does that ease your conscience at all about this lineup, or is there just a lot of concern about the losses of Bo, the loss of now Santander for much of the season, and then the potential for some guys to maybe not post season similar to the one that they did a year ago?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is a team that screams needs a bat, but the free agent pool has long since been decided in terms of impact guys there. And then beyond that, I mean, on the trade front, I don't know if maybe you could swing a deal there, but the Jays, certainly the front office hasn't indicated that they have any plans to do so. The word was that they felt it would eat into guys' playing time. Well, suddenly a large chunk of that has opened right up. I wonder about a guy maybe like a Joe Adele. Maybe that's a guy you could kind of
Joe
make a
Adele, wow.
play for. But I mean, I just don't know who could possibly be even on the market at this point, given it's so early into 2026. That was a name that got floated around a little bit. I think back in October or something, just around baseball as a potential candidate. But I can't even think of any other outfielders that could possibly still be on the move. You're gonna go into the season shorthanded.
The Phillies are looking to move Nick Castellanos.
Well, I mean, is that a
We'll
guy
move
you
on.
want to
We'll
bring
move
up?
on from that one. It's interesting. I mean, because if you are going to acquire an outfielder to take this Anthony Santander spot, it is somebody that needs to be a substantial improvement over Nathan Lucas or Davis Schneider, right? And at this point, we saw both of those guys have really productive 2025s, and I think you would feel fairly confident about them performing well in a platoon, right? In left field, because as things are lining up now, everything has kind of fallen into place for the Blue Jays, where it's Vlad at first, it's Ernie at second, it's Jimenez at short, it's Okamoto at third, it's Kirk behind the plate, it's Barger in right, it's Varsho in center, and then you kind of get to mix and match in left field with Schneider and Lucas, or if you want to toss in some of these other outfielders who will kind of be competing for that fourth, fifth spot, the Loperfidos, the
Well, that was something
Clases,
that
the
that was
Shreks.
something we had discussed at length, maybe an episode or two ago, and we kind of had our little prospect rundown. Um, there's a real opportunity for an Alan Roden 2.0 situation, be that RJ Shrek, be that Jonathan Clase, be that Joey Loperfido. There is that kind of glut of dudes, but again, the question just becomes, do any of those guys have the juice, have the capability to come in and contribute? Because, you think of Alan Roden, and he was a great story in spring, and the season rolls around and he struggles and struggles and struggles and struggles, to the point where he ultimately becomes part of a trade package for Louis Varland. If they can internally find a guy, that'd be great. But certainly, I think by May, if they're not the answer, then you have to go out and you have to acquire someone. And that creates its own kind of set of, machinations that will ultimately fall because of those dominoes. It becomes this cloud of uncertainty that suddenly shrouds the team on February 11th as we record this, right? That's very early for those kind of concerns to be popping up. And it's because they didn't ultimately find a way to add a bat in free agency. Not that that was necessarily a mistake, or specifically, obviously, an outfield bat. Not that that was a mistake. They made a play for Kyle Tucker, and we'd heard about maybe Alex Bregman was a guy they were in the mix for. They certainly made a play for Bo Bichette, but to walk away with none of those three, you're missing a big bat in the lineup.
How do you feel about the Schneider Lucas platoon? Because I sent you a text at I think it was 3 a.m. last night. That was I was not expecting to get an answer on, but of course, you answer me and you say that you are feeling very good about David Schneider entering this year. So this injury to Santander, like it very clearly opens up playing time for a Schneider and a Lucas. Like, does that not make you do you not feel better or do you not feel okay with those two being given those at bats because they will be in the platoon and are coming off that type of season?
I get it. There's confidence in both of those guys, but there's confidence in both of those guys being capable as stopgaps. The Santander upside speaks for itself. This guy popped 40 bombs before he ultimately broke when he joined the Blue Jays. And it to me feels like, a guy like a Davis Schneider, you could really kind of optimize him against exactly who you wanted. And a guy like a Nathan Lucas, he's a productive player, but ultimately not the type of guy, if you have real true kind of aspirations of greatness, it's tough to argue having him at the top of your lineup is the most effective use of that spot. So I get it. There's certainly a track record of success having those two kind of platoon or otherwise kind of play off each other, if you will. I just don't think that the upside on that is anywhere close to the upside and Anthony Santander presented. You think of Santander, I think most people had him penciled in for a 115, 120 WRC plus season if the bounce back went according to plan. And I think that for Schneider and for Lucas, I think, anything in that category, one of those guys would have to completely change who they are as a player. They'd have to develop some, enormous power in a very short period of time. And it just seems highly unlikely you're going to get that kind of production out of those two guys.
So fun new tool on Fangraphs this year. You can tap into the steamer projections based on splits. So they project how players will perform against various sides of pitching and handedness. So, if we're looking at a straight comparison of the Santander at bats to a Schneider Lucas platoon, David Schneider projected by Steamer against left-handed pitching to have a 109 WRC plus, and Anthony Santander projected to have a 96 WRC plus. And if we switch that over to the right-handed pitching, Santander 109 WRC plus, Nathan Lucas 113 WRC plus. Obviously, that's pretty low on Santander, I would say, because that is, you know, if you combine the two, then you're looking at a guy with like a 105 WRC plus, and sure, he's not going to be like a 130 guy. He's going to be, like you said, a 110, 115, 120. But I think that there is some value in the way that it shakes out for both of those guys to be able to make the most of their playing time in ideal spots, right? And then the defensive side of things too, where Nathan Lucas and David Schneider are going to be miles better than Anthony Santander in left field this year.
Do you think that we are getting not to the point because it's too early to say that, but would it shock you if on February 11th, 2027, the discussion around Anthony Santander was, is he even a Blue Jay anymore?
Well, I think there was like some of that this offseason, right? Like there was they need to dump him. And I mean, I would say no, partially because, but I don't know how much you want to like how much you subscribe to, like sunk cost and, you're trying to get some value out of that contract. Obviously, George Springer set for free agency after this year. And, so there's an easy slide for Santander into that DH role next year. But I mean, if he comes back in September and, let's say he struggles because that's kind of what you do, it wouldn't surprise me at all if he was a salary dump guy next offseason.
Yeah, which is frightening. I mean, again, the Jays just turned a George Springer, who looked like a salary dump guy himself, into a top five hitter in baseball. It's not impossible that, a guy like an Anthony Santander gets to that point, but, it's frightening right now thinking about, the potential boat anchor that you might have here. I mean, he's going to be out until likely August, something like that, potentially even September. Like, we
Yeah.
may be looking at a redux here of
We're
is
sitting there in the
Santander
last
going to be
week.
getting
Yeah.
enough ABs to be ready to roll.
Yeah. It's very funny to think about, the way that he came back last year. And like that's, very, very a likely possibility for something that would happen this year. If he takes a little bit longer to recover, and then, you're kind of getting into September and we're like, when's he gonna get into some AAA games? And, I think it was like what, the last week that he made it back, right? So we went pretty hard on the Santander thing here, but I mean, for you, like looking at the Blue Jays lineup, like who do you think this puts the most pressure on?
I kind of mentioned a couple names, but I think if I were to kind of dial in one, it feels like it's George Springer
Yeah,
because, with Barger, at the end of the day, even if he repeats his production from last year, it's still ultimately a successful season for him. Maybe not, you're obviously hoping for a step here, but it would still be productive. You look at some of the other guys, Kazuma Okamoto. Um, you don't know how he's going to transition to begin with. Maybe it puts a little bit of pressure on him to transition successfully, but if he doesn't,
I
I
think for
mean,
him, it like, you know, there's going to be the pressure to transition well, but I think it maybe puts a little bit more pressure for that transition to happen sooner, right? Because they're going to need kind of that guy, whether, he's hitting fourth, whether he's hitting fifth, like you're going to kind of need these guys behind Vladdy and behind Springer to, step up and kind of fill that role that you're hoping Santander was going to fill.
and I see that, I understand that, but to me, Springer puts together a career year at
Yeah.
age 36. It's unfathomable to ask him to repeat that. And now, if he doesn't, who is going to produce for these Blue Jays?
I guess we'll find out. One thing on the Santander, I saw a lot of Anthony Rendon mentions, and I'm here to say let's get that all the way out of here because Rendon, I like pet peeve of mine. Rendon kind of deserves for the hate because he's a guy who like dislikes baseball, and Santander seems like a joyful person, so I don't like those comparisons. But I get it. I get it. I get the injuries, the big contracts, and all that.
This episode of the Bird's Eye View podcast is brought to you by BioSteel. Use code Bird's Eye View at checkout for 20% off your order at biosteel.ca. Again, that's code Bird's Eye View at checkout for 20% off your order. For all your high performance hydration needs, visit biosteel.ca. Thank you again to BioSteel for sponsoring today's episode.
Let's move on. Shane Bieber not going to be ready for opening day with arm fatigue. When he opted in, we kind of sat there and you're like, well, that's interesting because he seemed poised for, if not a major payday, like a significant raise over the, $16 million that he was going to get by opting in.
So here's what I wonder, because is, you know, arm fatigue is arm fatigue, right? Like that's baseball for you. Uh, what I wonder is this kind of a precursor to his elbow having some issues once again? Because obviously he was successful when he came back with the Jays. He had his ups, he had his downs at times, but by and large came back and was productive. But, to have opted in, if he was worried about arm fatigue to start the season, that's still not that concerning of a situation where you have to worry about potentially exposing yourself where you sit there unsigned for a year and aren't able to recoup the 12, 16, whatever million it ultimately is, considering the deferral, opt out, all that stuff. So to me, I guess my question, my point of kind of curiosity is what exactly is going on here. Arm fatigue isn't normally something that shuts you down for 6 weeks, because if he's not going to be ready for opening day is at the end of March, and that's again 6 weeks away. So to me, I certainly think there's some concern to be gleaned here in terms of if the elbow is not really doing so hot, maybe the shoulder's not doing so hot. I just think that there's some concern, especially after having basically a winter to just kind of get that right. The fact that he opted in, just, it's a little frightening to think if he's even going to be a guy that can contribute for any extended point this year, or if it's just, a case of just, needs a little bit of extra time, a little extra R&R. I think of Jeff Hoffman last year, and obviously in the second half, his numbers kind of sputtered, but he came into the year with the same injury concern. He'd had his, shoulder concerns that got his contract ultimately voided with multiple teams. Would Bieber, you know, be able to kind of come in and pitch well the way that a guy like Jeff Hoffman did last year, despite those injury concerns, despite those concerns regarding his health? I mean, that's something that remains to be answered, but it still remains to me almost perplexing that it is literally, they've already bookmarked it. They've already said, hey, it's not happening for opening day.
Yeah, and I mean, Schneider shared today that Bieber got an MRI in the off season that showed forearm fatigue, so that kind of pinpoints it a little bit for us on the outside looking in, and it's so interesting just to see because when you come back from Tommy John, there is generally the Tommy John honeymoon period, right? And it kind of seemed like the Blue Jays were going to be getting a large chunk of that by him opting into this deal, but whether it was just him having to pitch maybe a little bit longer than he expected, coming back from the injury and then pitching some pretty intense innings in October and in the postseason, it maybe, that contributes to it a little bit, whether it's, maybe he came back too soon, maybe they pushed too hard because they gave up a premium asset for this guy to come in and be a top of the rotation arm in the playoffs, whether all that stuff kind of contributes to this. And I think Schneider said too, that they were just being cautious with him, right? And I think that's understandably fair for a guy coming off Tommy John who had like that heavy workload and that intense workload. But definitely doesn't, give you confidence that he is, one going to, obviously he's not going to be ready to start the year, but as you were kind of pointing out, like what is he going to look like when he gets onto the field, right? And because this is a guy who, I think when he first came back was probably the best that he looked as a Blue Jay. I think it was that and Game 4 of the World Series, I would say were his two best starts as a Blue Jay. And for those to kind of bookend some inconsistencies, it's there's certainly some questions, especially for a guy who isn't like this premium high strikeout level type of pitcher.
I mean, you kind of nailed it, right? It's just like we kind of said, it's of all the guys to have this kind of concern, it's certainly not who you want it to be. Not that you ever really want this, but it goes from something, oh, the power of friendship, oh, he opted in because he loved being on the Blue Jays, to, oh, I wonder if there's maybe some injury concerns, to, oh, he's not going to be ready for opening day.
Yeah. And so from that, obviously, the trickle down effect, of course, you don't have him for opening day. It maybe explains a little bit of why they were so aggressive on the pitching market, right? And, they go out and they sign Dylan Cease right away, and you're like, yeah, that makes sense. They obviously, kind of needed somebody to come in for the Bassett and the Scherzer starts and the replacement there. But then they go out and they add Cody Ponce, and you're kind of like, well, they got Eric Lauer, they got Jose Barrios, Gosman, CC Savage, Ponce, and Bieber. That's a pretty good five. But what are you going to do with these other guys? And now all of a sudden it's kind of like, well,
That's what
Gosman,
you're gonna do.
that's what you're going to do. And this obviously sets up the Jose Barrios thing. Obviously, some more comments today about kind of the relationship between the two sides during the World Series and how both probably wish they would have handled it better. Yada yada yada. Jose Barrios seems like a professional to me. Not, I wouldn't be surprised at all if, this kind of generally becomes a non-story, at least publicly, because, this is a thing that they probably figure out internally, and, you lock him into the rotation day one and you get him in there. And, even beyond that, I think you look at where this rotation stands, right? Like Gosman is coming off such a heavy workload as well. And I'm sure that, they're probably not going to treat him with kid gloves, but I'm sure there's going to be, hey, again, we want you at your best in September. We don't need you coming out guns blazing in April. And, Trey Savage is kind of the same thing where, would it surprise you at all if they manage his workload early on? So that, whether, however that works out with, maybe you piggyback him with Eric Lauer, maybe you mix in Eric Lauer every once in a while. But there's certainly all of a sudden with this Bieber news, the need and a role that you can actually see for all of these guys from opening day.
I just I don't know, man. The bull or excuse me, the rotation stuff, it just again, it just all becomes murky so early in
Yeah.
the spring. It's kind of like exactly the opposite of what you want.
But I mean, it happens that way for everyone though, right? Like there'll be, who was it like last year, right? Like there's always kind of some pitchers that come in and end up, being done for the year, or, being forced to miss significant time. And, I think of, obviously Kevin Gosman 2 years ago is probably a great example of where, he battled it all spring, and then he was, he ends up, I think, like making their fifth start of the regular season because they didn't want to put him on the IL, and then he was just kind of like he was playing catch up all year, right? And I would imagine that that's something that they don't want to do with Bieber. They don't want to do that with E Savage. They probably don't want to do that with Gosman again. And so I think that, if you're going to err on the side of caution, like at least they kind of do have the depth to do so, right? Like there isn't like Bieber being in the opening day rotation, you can afford not to have that because you have so many guys.
Yeah, because you spent all of this currency, you spent all of this asset, or whatever you want to term it. You spent all this money going out and doing so. This past winter, you've protected yourself against this, which I get, but it suddenly takes, a rotation that was in the discussion for, the best in the division to something a couple tiers below that.
Yeah, a few question marks for sure because I think who are you confident in, giving you a wire to wire season in 2026? I think Dylan Cease is one of those guys. I think, you can probably put Gosman in that conversation. And I think given the opportunity, Jose Barrios is probably in there as well.
Just depends on if he gets the opportunity.
Yeah. The in that conversation, of course, is Bowden Francis, and this is tough news for him having to undergo UCL reconstruction after the way 2025 went, coming off 2024, where I think there's a case to be made for him being the Blue Jays' best pitcher in that year. Of course, he chases a couple no hitters, is one of the best pitchers in the league in the second half and in September really, and for him to go through so many struggles and then come into this year and Ross Atkins said today that it was during his ramp up, he just felt it on one pitch, and now he's done for the year, and the Blue Jays lose that depth arm, which, last year 15 different Blue Jays made starts, and that includes some openers and some relievers. But if you want to get to a number of 15, like Bowden Francis was certainly within that group for 2026.
Yeah, I don't know where exactly necessarily slotted in, but it is just kind of the pitching depth being tested early.
Yeah,
And, was he the first guy to probably shuffle into the rotation? Probably not, but certainly think that, you would have expected him, maybe the second or third guy at the very least. And to already again be dipping into your pitching depth when you've already lost a Shane Bieber for a period here, depending on how long that exactly is, it's still a blow. I think of also the personal story here because to me that's the really tough one. It's a guy that it was, like a real bright spot on a Blue Jays team in 2024 that was just not fun to watch for large chunks. And in 2025, he wasn't ultimately able to be a substantial part of it. And he came a little bit back to earth, and then he got a little bit unlucky, even to a certain extent, with some of the home run to fly ball ratio stuff. But I mean, at the end of the day, you know, just like there's no such thing as a pitching prospect, what's the saying that you use? Every pitcher is healthy until they're
till
not,
they're
or
not. Yeah.
that's just kind of the nature of the beast. And it's tough to have it happen, while he's just having a side session before spring training. But at the end of the day, I mean, what are you going to do?
Yeah. So I just pulled it up here. How I we'll call it 10 Blue Jays made starts last year because there's a handful of openers. The Yariels, Louis Varland, Brain Fisher, Spencer Turnbull, Paxton Schultz all technically made starts for the Blue Jays. But so if we were to map out the let's say 10 Blue Jays who are going to 10 Blue Jays starters who are going to start for the major league team this year, and now we can't include Bowden Francis in that group. You got your top six, right? And it's Gosman, CEC, Savage, Barrios, Ponce, and we'll put Bieber in there. And then your seventh guy is Eric Lauer. And if you were drawing up like the next three, Bowden would have been in there. And now, you're kind of looking at Ricky Tiedemann, and we'll kind of get to him, Adam Macko, Lazaro Estrada, Jake Bloss if he's able to make it back this year. But, certainly, do you have more or less confidence in that group than Easton Lucas, Jose Urania, and say Bowden Francis?
I mean, I think at this point it's just different types of question marks. With an Easton Lucas, this is a guy that obviously didn't have the upside of Ricky Tiedemann, but at the same time, you know nothing about Ricky Tiedemann. You don't know if he's good, you
Yeah.
don't know if he's bad. And they've talked about that they will be building him up. Like, we've got it in our lineup, and the plan is to kind of have him stretch out a little bit. But this is still a dude that has not pitched very much since basically 2023. So even for him to get to the point where he's able to throw anything resembling any kind of bulk, I think would be really surprising. And, to that point, it just kind of puts you in a position where a guy that you knew would be capable of starting for you suddenly is just not in the picture. I mean, there's still enough kind of guys floating around either internally or externally that I think that you're not freaking out about losing Bowden Francis, but it's just war of attrition here, and the first salvo has been fired, and as I've said a couple times, it's February 11th.
Yeah, so let's dive in on Tiedemann a little bit more because we got a little bit more clarity on his status, obviously coming off Tommy John, which he underwent in, I believe it was July 2024, and he doesn't make it back to a competitive mound in 2025. So we'll be getting a new look at him in this spring training. I think a really interesting story to see where he can be. Obviously, Ross Atkins today says, they're going to be building him up, but essentially what he says is they're going to be flexible with the ability to shut him down if things don't go well, with the ability to ramp it up if things do, and a guy who basically has a pathway to impacting the major league team if the talent level does kind of break through at the upper minors, which we haven't really seen when you look at his time in the organization. I think you look at his time in Double A and Triple A, and he didn't really succeed from a run prevention standpoint at Double A in 2023, and then in 2024, kind of same thing at Triple A. So, the last time that we saw him like mowing down hitters in an environment that was higher than high A was in 2022 for 11 double A innings. So, I mean, I guess you can throw like the spring training outing that will live in Blue Jays history where, he strikes at Javi Baez and all that. But I think when you look at his story this year, it's really intriguing to see one, what his workload will be early on and how they manage that, and two, what the results actually are when he gets into minor league games.
Yeah, I think that second point in particular, because obviously not a guy that's going to start with the big league club, bearing something unforeseen. But if he can, start in Buffalo and find a groove there, I mean, certainly he's a guy that you want to be contributing. I mean, right now his competition for a bullpen spot is Mason Fluharty and Brendan Little, which certainly neither of those guys are old as Chapman or anything of the sort when we're talking high leverage lefties. The path exists for him to be a contributor. The question is if he'll get to that point, just generally speaking, because we haven't seen him at that point in so long, as you alluded to.
Yeah, he'll be fun one to watch. Another update we get is Jimmy Garcia, who of course, ends up undergoing season-ending surgery last year. He was pretty good to start the year. Obviously, Jimmy in a Blue Jays uniform has been excellent the last two calendar seasons. Of course, a trade mixed in there, but they say that he's been throwing. The hope is for him to be opening day. But again, they're gonna err on the side of caution and slow play things with him as well and make sure that he's healthy and ready to go. I mean, I don't think that there's a ton to glean from what they said about him today, but I think if you're looking at key members of this bullpen in 2026 and guys who are, if they're good, it takes this team to another level. Jimmy Garcia is certainly in that conversation, especially when, I think it was like there was three Jeff Hoffman questions asked today about where he's going to slot in and what their plan is for the closing role.
Yeah, understatedly important for sure. Would not be surprised if he's closing games for this team at some point, kind of in the dead of summer.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think if you're looking at the candidates to do it, it's him, it's Varland, it's Hoffman, maybe Fisher if things were to, go really well for Fish. But kind of last point that we wrote down here was Kazuma Okamoto will have a delayed arrival to spring training, and that they said he should be there by the weekend as he kind of works through some visa stuff. I don't, again, not really a huge, newsy point here. Like he's going to be there. It'll be all good. But I did want to ask you about this because this is kind of interesting where the Blue Jays have so many players playing in the World Baseball Classic, right? Like I think the list is, Vlad, it's Okamoto, it's not Barrios, but he's kind of on the secondary list. It's Kirk, it's Ernie, it's Jimenez. There's like so many guys that are on the Blue Jays that are going to play in the World Baseball Classic. Does that like concern you at all about the team in spring training and the fact that these guys are going to be gone for a couple weeks?
No, no, non-story. Doesn't bother me whatsoever. To me, I think especially because basically when you rhymed off the hitter, um, it gets you some, high stress games in March.
Here's the full list before. So it's Mako, it's Yariel, it's Leo Jimenez, it's Kirk, it's Ernie, it's Okamoto, it's Vlad, CJ Stubbs, RJ Schreck, Andres Jimenez, Will Cresswell, and Ismail Mungia. Apologies for the pronunciation. I know that's not
Yeah,
right.
it's almost all hitters. If you want to talk about simulating important game or anything of the sort, you're not going to get that in spring training. Do spring training stats matter? And I mean, how much do they matter in terms of compared to the World Baseball Classic? I guess maybe you have some, maybe not concern is the wrong word, but Ernie Clement's going to be a bench guy. I mean, you don't know how many reps he's ultimately going to get, ramping up, but at the same time, I just don't think that it's something that to me is of much real concern. Especially the word is with Ernie Clement is he could step off the street in the middle of January and, put the bat on the ball. This is a guy that's, knows his role and does it very well.
Yeah. Not a concern, I would say. Just good for those guys to go represent their countries and to get like some high level game experience. And for some of them, you'll see some good playing time. I think for a guy like Leo Jimenez too, where he should be like a Panama, one of like the top of their lineup guys. So, um, yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of all that I had taken away from today's avails and seeing John Schneider and Ross Atkins on Zoom calls. But was there kind of anything else that stood out to you aside from the things that we've touched on so far? I think that we've gone pretty in depth on all of it, but if there's anything else to you that stood out.
No, I definitely think that, it's a news dumpy kind of day, but, at the end of the day, I think that there's still a lot to learn about these Blue Jays. And, there's facing some adversity early, to say the very least. But at the end of the day, the beat goes on and spring just around the corner, and we'll have lots of stuff on that in the coming days. So, I mean, just, boys of summer, slowly but surely, they're making their way back.
As they say, spring has sprung or spring is springing, I suppose. Tomorrow morning we'll get all of the videos from the first day pitchers and catchers, the first avails. I guess all the injury news out of the way, but before we run, Jory, um, one thing that you are excited to see from a visual standpoint as we get all of these videos from the beginning of camp.
We saw a little bit of it kind of earlier, but uh, I'd like to see some Dylan Cease, and I'd like to see some Cody Ponce. That's what I'm really looking for.
Yes. Will be fun to see the new guys. I guess that's kind of always the best part. I guess the Max Scherzer was the kind of the headliner last year, and Cease and Ponce will be good to see. And I think it's always cool to see Vladdy, and he'll probably be a little bit further along with his prep for the World Baseball Classic getting going. But it's going to be fun, and we will certainly be back to cover it all as things happen and as the season arrives. But that is going to do it for us here today at the Bird's Eye View podcast. Make sure to hit the subscribe and like buttons if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening along on the audio provider of your choice, make sure to drop a follow and review. You can follow us all on Twitter. I am at Worden_Zach. Jory's at Jori Negin-Shecter, and the pod is at BEV_pod. Thanks so much for listening, and enjoy the start of spring.